The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm so excited to welcome to the show for the very first time, Dr. Darren Freebury-Jones. Welcome.
It's fabulous to join you, Rebecca. How are you doing?
I am doing well, and I'm a little nervous. I know you know this because we're talking about Shakespeare today, and this is a subject that I am not well versed on at all. So before we get started, why don't you tell the audience why it is we're talking to you today and why you're my Shakespeare guy?
Yes, I'm hoping you'll be a veritable bardolater, Shakespeare's number one fan by the end of this interview. So I am a Welsh-born lecturer in Shakespeare studies. So I live in Cardiff and I lecture in Shakespeare's hometown of Stratford upon Avon. I'm a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and I've written several books on Shakespeare and other playwrights who were working during the time of his career. So today we're talking about my latest book, which is Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers: How Early Modern Playwrights Shaped the World's Greatest Writer. And in that book, I just try and anchor Shakespeare in his historical and theatrical context and show him very much as a man of the theatre. Shakespeare's not just this great poet on a pedestal. He's not just this great playwright. He's also an actor. And I think that's very important in terms of the evolution of his artistry and accounts in part for why it is that Shakespeare is so frequently studied as opposed to some of those other writers who were in his milieu.
Yeah, exactly. And that's my first question because everybody knows the name Shakespeare. Why is it that everybody knows his name so well and not the other ones as well?
Yes, it's a pretty huge question, that, to be honest, Rebecca, but I think in part it's because his canon of works is pretty much preserved. We've got a couple of missing plays that we think Shakespeare wrote. A sequel to his comedy Love's Labour's Lost called Love's Labour's Won, which ironically seems to be Love's Labour's Lost. A play called Cardenio, which might survive in fragments through a restoration adaptation. But a lot of other playwrights during the period were jumping from company to company. And Shakespeare, on the other hand, he works pretty much for the same company throughout his dramatic writing career. So the Lord Chamberlain's Men from 1594 onwards, and they get renamed the King's Men in 1603, when King James VI of Scotland and the First of England becomes not only the monarch of England, but also Shakespeare's company's patron. So Shakespeare has got the king himself as his boss, which is wonderful. On the one hand, Shakespeare's company are known as the dominant acting company in Jacobean London. But of course, Shakespeare wouldn't want to offend his patron and his monarch through his plays. He runs the risk of having his ears or nose slit or maybe even imprisonment. So in 1623, several years after Shakespeare died in 1616, you have his fellow company members collect the bulk of his plays in the 1623 first folio. So Shakespeare's got a much larger canon of works that can be studied, that can be put on in performance, that can be read. But there was a very important theatre manager named David Garrick in the 18th century, and he made enormous contributions to Shakespeare's legacy. So Garrick was an actor manager, as I've mentioned, and he was famous for reforming audience behavior, but also, a bit like Shakespeare himself, taking advantage of the later special effects. So David Garrick famously played Hamlet, and for the moment when the Danish prince encounters the ghost of his father, David Garrick was wearing a hydraulic wig. So his hair literally stood on end like quills upon the fretful porcupine. And when the theatres reopened around 1660 during the Restoration period, Shakespeare was popular, but so were other writers like Ben Jonson, who was a friend of Shakespeare's, and John Fletcher. But I think there's a difference with Shakespeare in that Ben Jonson saw himself as a classicist. So his plays adhere to the unities of time, place, and action. So they usually take course over the duration of the play, say 3 to 4 hours, usually set in a single location. They don't mingle plots and subplots. That's pretty much the opposite to Shakespeare.
Mm.
So Johnson seeing himself as a neoclassical dramatist. That's often associated with France. So for David Garrick, Shakespeare feels more quintessentially British. And although, like every other playwright of the era, writing for the public theatre, Shakespeare collaborated with other dramatists, the bulk of his plays are solo. And John Fletcher, on the other hand, is a deeply collaborative playwright. So I think that accounts in part for why it is that Shakespeare, as opposed to some of these other writers, is far more well known today in the 21st century.
Yeah. Well, and I think you mentioned too, Shakespeare started off as an actor, didn't he?
Yes, yes. Well, Shakespeare seems to have acted throughout his writing career. And the very first accounts we get of Shakespeare as an actor dramatist in London is something of a bad review.
Hmm.
So it comes from a 1592 pamphlet called Green's Groat's Worth of Wit, which is attributed to a fellow Elizabethan playwright named Robert Greene. Now, some of your viewers and listeners might recognize Robert Greene as Shakespeare's pantomimic arch rival in a British sitcom called Upstart Crow. And there's a very interesting woodcut engraving of Robert Greene suited in death's livery, where he looks a bit like an ear of corn or a particularly pensive banana. So check out that 1598 woodcut engraving if you're curious. And Robert Greene had some issues with actors. So he thinks that the actors are taking all of the credit, even though the dialogue they deliver on stage, that stems from the playwright's wit. And he calls actors puppets, these apes that speak from our mouths. And he's got a real issue with a certain shake scene. So lots of dodgy puns in invective pamphlets during the period. And he calls this shake scene an upstart crow who, despite not being university educated like Robert Greene, and despite being a mere player, a mere actor, has the audacity to turn his hand to writing plays and is trying to bombast out a blank verse as the best of other writers, such as Christopher Marlowe. And this Shake scene is a Johannes factotum, so a jack of all trades. And that passage in the pamphlet Green's Groat's Worth of Wit paraphrases a line from the play known as Henry VI, Part 3 by Shakespeare. So he writes, "O tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide," which parodies this fantastic moment where York in Shakespeare's play harangues Margaret of Anjou and says, "O tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide." So we know from that account, which was published after Robert Greene's death in 1592, that Shakespeare was an actor and a playwright on the scene in the early 1590s. We know he acted in the plays of Ben Jonson, who I mentioned earlier. So in 1616, you have the works of Benjamin Jonson. So Jonson is the first writer to have his plays collected together in an expensive, sturdy folio edition. And he got a bit of stick for that, actually. So a poet named John Suckling said that Ben Jonson deserves the bays, for his were called works, while others were but plays. That's worth stressing, actually, is that plays during Shakespeare's time weren't seen as these great works of literature in the way that they are today. Fundamentally, this was an entertainment industry designed to engage audiences in order to make money. But in the Jonson 1616 folio, we've got a couple of cast lists. So we know that Shakespeare was acting in one of Jonson's comedies in 1598 called Every Man in His Humour. And then in 1603, he acted in a Jonson tragedy called Sejanus. Now, we don't actually know any specific role that Shakespeare took as an actor. So there are traditions that he played very well an old man in the comedy As You Like It, named Adam. And there are also traditions that he played the ghost of Hamlet's father. And I think it's fair to say that the actor playing Hamlet, Shakespeare's star actor Richard Burbage, probably wasn't wearing a hydraulic wig. And you also had another contemporary, a poet named John Davis of Hereford, who said that Shakespeare often played kingly parts in sport. So it's conceivable, I think, that Shakespeare took many of the monarchical roles in his plays.
Do we have any idea of the type of personality that Shakespeare had, just as a person, not necessarily in his writing, but do we have any idea what he was like?
Yes, I think Shakespeare frustrates a lot of people because they want to know what he was like, and he can be quite elusive. I think, unlike writers such as Ben Jonson, he doesn't put too much of himself in his plays. You do get the sense that Johnson, for example, is often writing about himself and will present a character who is a version of himself. He was engaged in the so-called war of the theatres. So playwrights were lampooning each other and putting characters on stage who were representative of the playwrights. But we get quite conflicting accounts when it comes to Shakespeare. So there's one tradition that he wasn't a company keeper, that he didn't like to socialize, that he would sooner pretend to be ill. And I always remember when I was in my salad days, a young student at university, visiting a very famous Shakespeare scholar in London and going to a pub. And apparently Shakespeare drank in this pub in London, although apparently Shakespeare drank in pretty much every pub in London. And I said to this professor, what do you think Shakespeare would be doing if he was sitting here now in this pub? And this professor said, oh, he'd probably be sat in the corner listening. So I think Shakespeare would have been a great listener. And in order to succeed as an actor, you had to be a great listener. You've only got a few weeks to rehearse these plays. You've only got cue scripts, so your own lines and a couple of words from preceding speeches. But then we also get other accounts of Shakespeare as something of a hellraiser. So there's one account of him traveling to a nearby town near Stratford-upon-Avon called Bidford-upon-Avon because he's heard of these famous drinkers there and he wants to challenge them. And the drinkers weren't there when Shakespeare arrived, but Shakespeare got drunk anyway. And I'm not sure how authentic this anecdote is because apparently in a drunken stupor, Shakespeare fell asleep under a crab apple tree and the tree became magical. And
Oh,
there's another, well, yeah, as trees are wont to do, apparently. But there's another anecdote as well that comes from the vicar of Stratford-upon-Avon, named John Ward, who says that Shakespeare died after a merry meeting with Ben Jonson and another writer named Michael Drayton, and it seems Shakespeare drank too hard, for he died of a fever there contracted. And I've always found that curiously comforting, the idea of arguably the world's greatest writer dying of a really bad hangover. I can empathize with that, I think. But Shakespeare's elusive, and I think although some people find that frustrating because they want to know what the man was like, what were his views, were his political or religious views, for example. But as an actor dramatist, he's accustomed to inhabiting all sorts of different roles and giving voice to characters from all kinds of socio-economic backgrounds, different races, different genders. And I think in part that's why, to go back to your first question, Shakespeare prevails today because there's a certain interpretive flexibility with his works. He would have spent a long time at grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon learning how to voice different sides of an argument. I think he's always flipping a coin. So you can put on his comedy, The Merchant of Venice, for instance, and you can portray the Jewish character Shylock, as he has been historically, as something of an anti-Semitic caricature, as the villain of the play, or he could be portrayed as the tragic protagonist of that play. And I can think of few writers who are capable of creating characters who can be performed in such diametrically opposed ways.
Yeah, and when you say he sits in the bar, like say back in the corner observing, that's such a writer trait, isn't it? Like I just imagine like all writers like to observe and pay attention to human behavior. So yeah, maybe he was sitting back in the corner, pounding back a few glasses and as
I think there could be something to that. And Shakespeare is quite idiosyncratic among other writers of the period, in that he often writes of hearing rather than seeing
Hmm.
a play. So for Shakespeare, I think theatre was an aural, not just an ocular experience. So certainly, I think we can be confident that Shakespeare was a good listener.
I love that. And as far as dying from drinking too much, as somebody in their mid 40s, I will have to say that I have had moments where I wake up with a hangover and wish I were dead at that moment.
It's the kind of existential crisis. You suddenly become Shakespeare's Hamlet, I think. Yeah.
I love that. One of the things I would love to talk about is maybe how his career changed over time as a playwright. How did his writing change? Because I think it's inevitable for anyone to evolve over time. Can you talk about that?
Yes, that's a great question. I think when Shakespeare first appears on the scene, to go back to that Green's Groat's worth of wit pamphlet, he's an imitative playwright. And imitation was seen as a virtue during the time. It's regarded quite differently today. So this is something that would have been drilled into Shakespeare as part of his grammar school education. There was a real emphasis on bettering your inspirations and your sources, bettering your instruction, as Shylock puts it in The Merchant of Venice. So at the start of his career, Shakespeare's early plays do read like patchworks of lines that you will find in other Elizabethan dramatists, such as Christopher Marlowe, such as Thomas Kidd, and another writer named George Peele. But I think even right at the start of his career, he's weaving threads of other writers' plays, but into a dramatic tapestry that is distinctly his own. So Shakespeare's very innovative in terms of his verse style. So plays during the period are often written in what's known as blank verse, so unrhyming verse with 10 syllables per line, five unstressed syllables, five stressed syllables. And it follows a rhythm that goes like this, dee-dum, dee-dum, dee-dum. Some people say it resembles a human heartbeat. Others might say that's de-dumbing it down. But right from the start of his career, Shakespeare's quite different to university educated playwrights in that he often incorporates an 11th syllable, so the so-called feminine ending. So even when you have Shakespearean speeches that sound like the ranty, muscular, bombastic language of Christopher Marlowe, for example, you can see that actually Shakespeare is quite distinct in several respects. And I think all the way through his career, something I've discovered writing Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers is that Shakespeare keeps turning back to those formative experiences. When he arrives in London, his head is often in the Elizabethan period. He's taking inspiration from those works, and he's often adapting earlier storylines. And as his career progresses, in some respects, I think his Jacobean plays feel darker than his Elizabethan plays. I'm not sure if that says anything about the sort of propaganda of the golden age of Elizabeth, but his comedies become quite problematic. And this is a great thing about Shakespeare is that he often likes to raise questions, very rarely provides firm answers on anything. So according to the comic genre, it's all about union in those conclusions, bringing characters together, typically through marriage. But Shakespeare, later in his career, starts writing comedies that I think when you leave the theatre, you think, oh, that was a lovely, sparkling occasion, that comic play. And then you go, oh, hang on. No, actually, that was a bit weird, that ending. So you've got a play called Measure for Measure, for instance, where at the end of the play, the Duke turns to a character named Isabella and basically says, we're going to get married. And Isabella doesn't respond. But Isabella is a nun and she's a member of the Order of St. Clair, which forbid interactions with men. That's the order that she wants to join. So would she be happy with the Duke's proposal of marriage? I'm not so sure. And you have another play called All's Well That Ends Well, which is a bitterly ironic title, I think, because you have the heroine of that play, Helena, tricks a man who has no feelings for her whatsoever into marrying her. And there's a bed trick as well. So she swaps the place of someone that Bertram, he's called, actually fancies. So that's very problematic in terms of how that union arises. So I think that's an aspect that you see with Shakespeare, is that his plays do often feel quite dark, and even his lightest comedies often have some shades of grey in them, and stylistically as well. But whereas Shakespeare is innovative in terms of those 11 syllable lines, so you're getting a sense of linguistic flexibility. Other writers like John Fletcher, I mentioned earlier, they fly a pitch above him. So they're using 11 syllables, the so-called feminine ending, which is a bit of a sexist term, I think, far more frequently than Shakespeare is later on in his career. So whereas Shakespeare, when you look at his early plays, he feels like the new kid on the block, very sexy, very exciting. When you read his older plays in comparison to other younger contemporaries, he starts to feel more like a playwright who is distinctly Elizabethan in terms of when he began his writing career.
Interesting. And I love that you brought up the adaptation part of this, because we're going to talk about why everybody thinks Shakespeare was somebody else. So let's dive into that, because I feel like that has been the biggest debate and controversy for centuries. Like, who was the real Shakespeare? Why do you think we have this discussion?
Well, I think in part it's because Shakespeare has attained this celebrity status that he didn't have during his lifetime. You can compare the reaction to Shakespeare's death to the reaction of the death of his star actor Richard Burbage. The whole country was in mourning. So Shakespeare was recognized as, a great writer, but one of several great writers during the period. And I don't tend to engage with the so-called Shakespeare authorship question, because I think there's good reason why historians don't doubt Shakespeare's authorship of the plays. There's ample documentary evidence, and in part, I think it's slightly classist. This idea that this Warwickshire boy couldn't have possibly written these plays, that the writer of these plays had to be of the nobility. And I think it also undermines just how robust grammar school education was during the period. So they worked schoolboys incredibly hard, and a grammar school education was pretty much the equivalent of a modern classics degree today. So I think Shakespeare actually, as an actor, playwright, he had all of the tools at his disposal in order to write great works of poetry and great plays. And there were other very popular dramatists who were also actors. So Ben Jonson started off as an actor. Unlike Shakespeare, he seems to have turned away from acting as quickly as he possibly could. Another writer named Thomas Hayward, writers such as Robert Wilson. Nathan Field was a great playwright who often collaborated with John Fletcher, who started off playing female roles on the stage because women weren't allowed to perform female roles on the public stages until 1660, so decades after Shakespeare died in 1616. And there's a great example, I think, would be a play called The Book of Sir Thomas More, where there are 5 authors involved in that play, and we think Shakespeare was one of them. So Shakespeare writes this wonderful speech where Sir Thomas More quells an anti-immigration riot, and I would recommend it if you haven't watched or listened to it. Google Ian McKellen, Thomas More, after watching or listening to this interview, because McKellen does just a wonderful version of that speech. So there's five authors involved in that play. We think Shakespeare was one of them, but only one of those five major dramatists of the period appears to have been university educated, and that's Thomas Hayward, who I mentioned earlier. So I think one of the things I try and do in the book, like I said earlier, was anchor Shakespeare in his historical and theatrical context. And although it deals in matters of authorship, who wrote what during the period, who collaborated with who, I don't touch upon the authorship question itself because, like I said, I don't think there's any historical basis for questioning Shakespeare's authorship. And those conspiracy theories really kickstarted in around the mid 19th century.
Of course. The
Yes.
Victorians again. I feel like we have to blame the Victorians for everything. It always seems like they just, yeah. Well, Darren, I want to know, as someone who doesn't know a lot of Shakespeare, in school, I think we learned Romeo and Juliet, which is the classic, right? And Midsummer Night's Dream. And that's pretty much it. And so for me, reading Shakespeare is very difficult. So, how can you help me as somebody who would like to read more Shakespeare and understand it? How can you help me become better with it?
I'm reminded of my A-level days. So when I was a teenager, 16, 17, and whenever there was a topic I found particularly difficult or wasn't necessarily that interested in, I would play a certain mental trick on myself and I'd say, I'm really interested in this. I'm really interested in learning more. So I think you have to find that initial passion in the first instance. And Shakespeare wrote a lot of history plays. So you've got a
Yeah.
passion for history. There's a lot of Henry plays in Shakespeare's canon. Two Henry IV plays, Henry V, three Henry VI plays, Richard II, Richard III, Henry VIII, which is a play Shakespeare co-wrote with John Fletcher towards the end of his career. So I think it's fascinating having a look at the ways in which Shakespeare deals with historical narratives and conveys historical processes on stage for his Elizabethan and Jacobean contemporaries. So how he's showing the ways in which historical processes recur.
Mm.
And I always remember seeing a production of Richard III in Stratford-upon-Avon, and I'd been watching the news about an hour before, and it was all about the Prime Minister receiving multiple votes of no confidence. And towards the end of Shakespeare's Richard III, Richard gets deserted by all of his allies. And a character says, he hath no friends, but which are friends for fear, which in his time of greatest need will fly from him. And I
Mm.
thought, my goodness,
Yeah.
this is the relevance, the resonance of Shakespeare today, that you're seeing this play written over 400 years ago and depicting a monarch from way before Shakespeare's time, and it feels urgently relevant. I think as well it helps to read Shakespeare out loud, and I definitely recommend watching as many film adaptations as possible. But one thing I particularly like to do when I need a refresher on a play I'm about to teach is when I'm in the car on a long journey, I'll listen to an audio adaptation of Shakespeare. And this is the great thing about Shakespeare. He places so much emphasis on listening that even though you cannot see the characters, you can see them in your mind's eye because Shakespeare makes it so clear by the ways in which he individualizes each role as to who is speaking, the kind of personalities he's presenting on stage. But his plays were very much written to be performed aloud. So I think that's always very helpful.
That's what I'll have to do. Definitely. I love that, I got to make fun of the Victorians' take on history because this is a perfect segue for my next question too, because I want to know, how has Shakespeare's take on events in history affected the telling of history?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think a great example would be Richard III, where he doesn't paint a very nice picture of Richard, and he is reaching back to some of his chronicle source materials in terms of a very negative depiction of that ruler. One account that is a personal favourite of mine comes from John Rouse, who presents Richard as a wonderful monarch during his reign. And then when Henry VII is on the throne, he says that Richard was born with shoulder-length hair and teeth. So he's this kind of abomination. So you've got this sense of propaganda when Shakespeare's writing, and a lot of his history plays are written during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. So uh, it kind of makes sense not to depict Richard III in a particularly favourable light, but I think Shakespeare is very much an entertainer, a bit like Robbie Williams. That's something that's worth remembering, that he's less interested in historical accuracy than really entertaining his audiences. And I think with a figure like Richard III, he sees an opportunity to create an astounding Machiavellian villain who, a bit like a pantomime villain, we love to hate, or sometimes potentially hate to love. So it's worth bearing that in mind, I think, is that Shakespeare has had a huge impact on how we see history, but the man himself was not necessarily interested in a sense of veracity because he's often conflating decades into a play that's going to be performed on stage for 2 to 4 hours, and he's always got his audiences at the forefront of his mind.
I feel like Shakespeare has become such a huge part of pop culture, even today. As an example, my Roku, when it goes into sleep mode, has Shakespeare quotes that come up on the
Oh,
screen, and it just kind of rotates from quote to quote. And so sometimes I just like to sit and read them and try and figure out because it'll show the quote and then it'll put which play later underneath it. So then I try and guess. I don't know anything about Shakespeare, but
but you're imbibing these quotations, and yes, just so many phrases that we use today that appear in Shakespeare's works, and uh, there have been some overestimations, I think, in terms of Shakespeare's contributions to the English language when it comes to how big his vocabulary was. So there was a scholar named Alfred Hart in the 1940s who argued that Shakespeare contributed somewhere between 1,700 and 3,000 words to the English language. And when Shakespeare was writing, coining was hugely popular. So you didn't have any real dictionaries during the period, and it's been estimated that around 8,000 new words were invented during Shakespeare's lifetime. But other writers, it seems, had bigger vocabularies than Shakespeare. But I think it's quality over quantity. And we have these images of just how big Shakespeare's vocabulary was, and the extent of his contributions to the English language today, because in the Oxford English Dictionary, a lot of words of the period are attributed firstly to Shakespeare, but we have digital databases so we can find out if a word like eyeball, for example, occurred in an earlier work. But I think it's fair to say that Shakespeare popularized a lot of these words and popularized a lot of these phrases. And I'm a very irritating individual to hang out with, I think, because I just speak in Shakespeare tags. So I'm constantly, whether consciously or subconsciously, recycling Shakespeare's idiom in everyday conversation.
when you're passionate about something, it's all right. The people around you must adapt.
They're rolling their eyeballs, yes.
Yes, yes. Well, one of the things that I think about too, with Shakespeare is these calendars you can get nowadays, like Shakespeare insults. Like
Yes.
they're brilliant, and you go through them, and I wish I had an example off the top of my head, but you just read them and you start laughing and go, that is a brilliant way to insult somebody.
He was great at insults. So we often think of Shakespeare in terms of the beautiful poetry he was capable of writing, and the visual poetry as well, that his plays are performed on a bare stage, often in an open air theatre around 2 in the afternoons, which is quite tricky if you want to set a scene at night. You've got daylight spilling down on audiences. And think of Macbeth, for example, two-thirds of which are set at night. So that kind of descriptive language, that poetic language, is actually very important because Shakespeare is working on his audience's imaginary forces. And I'm quoting the prologue to Henry V there. So he's capable, well, more than capable of writing stunning poetry. But I think he is very canny when it comes to an insult like "you bull's pizzle," or a particular favorite of mine appears in the play King Lear, where a character named Kent calls another character a horse and zed, thou unnecessary letter.
See what I mean? It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And of course, then we look at film or TV as well. And the first ones that come to mind, and you're probably going to roll your eyes that I even mention it, is Shakespeare in Love.
Oh no, I'm not going to roll my eyes at
Oh,
all.
oh,
Yeah.
I think I've watched that like 3 times because it just kind of, I don't know, it gets me interested in something that I wouldn't normally be interested in.
Yeah, I think Shakespeare in Love is actually a very useful film for people when it comes to being introduced to Shakespeare. That yes, it is cinema, and yes, it takes a lot of liberties in terms of what we know historically and conflates many, many years where Shakespeare writes Romeo and Juliet and then instantly jumps to Twelfth Night, whereas we think Romeo and Juliet written around 1595, Twelfth Night around 1601. But what that film does is showcases Shakespeare as a man of the theatre. And this is a business operation. It's a commercial operation with a large literary turnover. And the theatre managers are desperate for fresh material. And Shakespeare's servicing that. And there's one moment in Shakespeare in Love that really stands out to me, which is when Shakespeare meets fellow Elizabethan playwright Christopher Marlowe and he's in the pub with Marlowe, and Marlowe says to him, "What are you working on at the moment, Bill?" And Shakespeare responds, "Oh, this new play I'm really excited about, Kit. It's called Romeo and Ethel, the pirate's daughter. What about you?" And Marlowe just responds, "The Massacre at Paris." And Shakespeare sighs enviously and says, "Good title, good title." Now we don't have any documentary evidence that Shakespeare met Christopher Marlowe, who is author of, yes, The Massacre at Paris, but also very well-known plays today, such as Dr. Faustus, where you have this Magus figure sell his soul so he can use the demon Mephistopheles for 24 years. But I do get the sense that these writers in an intensely competitive, collaborative and narrow world in early modern London, they would have met each other potentially at the theatres, potentially at St. Paul's Churchyard, the book-selling centre of London, or potentially in the pubs. And from personal experience, I think a lot of great creativity happens in pubs. And there's an anecdote about a writer I mentioned earlier, John Fletcher. So a younger writer than Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. And he often wrote with a playwright named Francis Beaumont. So apparently they lived together on Bankside and shared the same clothes, the same cloak between them, even the same lover.
I knew you were going to say that.
Well, yeah. So this suggests an intensely collaborative relationship as well as a rather limited wardrobe. But there's an anecdote that John Fletcher and his co-author were planning a play in a London tavern, and John Fletcher said, "You stab the king, and I'll poison the queen." And apparently, an innkeeper or a waiter overheard this conversation and immediately ran out for the police. But I think that does give you a sense of the lived experience of these men. And I think Shakespeare in Love is a very useful film. And I always remember I was giving a lecture on Romeo and Juliet, and quite early in terms of my Shakespeare lecturing career. And my manager said to me, "Oh, it's very curious. This this school group, their curriculum is called Shakespeare in Love. And I thought, oh yeah, he said, I've never heard of that one. So the group arrived, and there I was, prepared to talk about Romeo and Juliet. And as I was speaking, the teacher held up her hand and said, "Oh no, we're not studying Romeo and Juliet. We're studying the movie Shakespeare in Love." And I hadn't seen Shakespeare in Love
Oh
for
no.
years, so I was reaching into the cellarage, the basement of my mind, and making a couple of tenuous connections. So mentioned John Webster, the writer, and said, "Oh yes, and he's got a cameo in Shakespeare in Love." But the talk went very well. But I think actually that was a bit of an eye opener to how useful Shakespeare in Love was for understanding Shakespeare's original theatrical context. And of course, it went hand in hand with Romeo and Juliet, which is the play he is writing in that movie.
Hmm. Why do you think Romeo and Juliet is the play that everybody knows and is taught at a young age?
Yeah, it's a little bit weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
That you often get lines from Romeo and Juliet appear in Valentine's Day cards because it doesn't end well, that play. And it was very popular during Shakespeare's time. There was another writer named John Marston, who is a fascinating figure I write about in Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers. And he complained that naught but pure Juliet and Romeo was being performed in the London theatres. But I think it's a very popular play in some respects because it's a tragedy of love. So quite innovative during the period that there weren't many tragedies of love in theatrical repertoires. And I actually think Romeo and Juliet would make for a pretty good comedy. So for the first couple of acts, we're whisked away on this amazing love story, Romeo and Juliet meeting, sharing a sonnet, which is not generally how people woo today, I don't think. It's not really the equivalent of Tinder. And you meet these lovable characters like Benvolio, Mercutio, and the nurse, and then bang, Mercutio is slain, and the play takes a deep dive into the realm of tragedy. So I think it's got a bit of everything for audiences. It's got those comic aspects, and it's also utterly heartbreaking in its conclusion. And this is something that's worth emphasizing is that during Shakespeare's time, it wasn't about telling new stories necessarily. It was about telling existing stories in innovative ways. So Shakespeare was able to draw from many sources and analogues when it came to writing Romeo and Juliet. And you had a poem by a writer named Arthur Brooke called Romeus and Juliet. And one of the interesting things about Shakespeare is that when you look at his plays in comparison to his sources, you often find stark moralistic messages in those sources. So in that poem by Arthur Brooke, the message of Romeus and Juliet is do not disobey your parents. And I don't see Shakespeare as a didactic writer. I don't think he's that interested in conveying messages. He's more about raising questions. So he produces a play that plot-wise isn't original, but in so many respects is actually really innovative with Romeo and Juliet.
Um,
So it's definitely one of his most beloved dramas, I think.
as you were just talking about that, I was thinking, do you think Romeo and Juliet as a style written in that way and being this love story of two people who, shouldn't be together. Do you think that had any influence on like modern day romantic comedies? Because I feel like there's very similar arcs, except we usually have happy endings, right, with romantic comedies, whereas Shakespeare was a little different.
Well, he was in Romeo and Juliet, yes. But as we ascertained earlier, even in his loveliest comedies, he often raises some questions. But yes, certainly, I think Romeo and Juliet has had a huge cultural impact where you've got paintings of the lovers hanging in art galleries around the world, and you've got adaptations of the place such as West Side Story. Romeo and Juliet is a personal favorite of mine. And I think absolutely it has exerted an influence on the rom-com genre because they're kind of seen as the archetypal lovers, Romeo and Juliet, aren't they?
They
Even though
are.
they don't actually have that much time together before losing their lives.
It is a tragic love story, really, when it comes down to it.
It absolutely is, yes.
Darren, I've really enjoyed this. So I want you to take this opportunity now to pitch your book to the listeners. I know we haven't
Oh,
covered, we've covered maybe a quarter of what was in your book. I really focused on Shakespeare with you. So I want to give you the opportunity to sell it so that the listeners go out and buy your book.
absolutely. So here it is again. Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers, How Early Modern Playwrights Shaped the World's Greatest Writer. This is a play that, as I've mentioned, it anchors Shakespeare in his historical context. So I write about the ways in which Shakespeare's education and his dual role as an actor playwright, how that contributed to the evolution of his artistry. And the book goes through Shakespeare's relationships with numerous other writers whose careers intersected with his. So, beginning with a writer named John Lilly, who produced comedies featuring cross-dressing heroines, battles of wit, song incorporated into drama. So John Lilly paves the way for many of Shakespeare's comedies, all the way to Shakespeare's relationship with John Fletcher at the end of his career, with whom Shakespeare writes plays such as Henry VIII, the Lost Cardenio, and a play called The Two Noble Kinsmen. And this is a trade book. So I've tried to make this as entertaining and accessible as possible. So it's got several elements of my questionable humor, I think. And I really hope that it increases reader knowledge and that they have an enjoyable experience with this book, because it was an absolute joy to write. And during the course of the book, you will meet, aside from just Shakespeare, so many fascinating figures of the period and some pretty big personalities, such as the prickly, rather grumpy figure of Ben Jonson, or you'll meet Christopher Marlowe and encounter his volcanic impact and his comparatively short life, where Christopher Marlowe was stabbed above the right eye in a house in Deptford and apparently died swearing, which is how I would like to go, I think.
I love that. And if people would like to go out and purchase your book or any other works that you've done, where can they do that?
Yeah, so Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers is available in all good bookshops. So you could find it in W.H. Smith, Waterstones, and so on. Online via the publisher Manchester University Press's website. It's also available on Amazon and so forth. And you'll find other books I've written as well. So a book about Robert Greene called Reading Robert Greene, Recovering Shakespeare's Rival, and a book about the writer Thomas Kidd called Shakespeare's Tutor, the influence of Thomas Kidd. So Thomas Kidd shared lodgings with Christopher Marlowe in London and had a huge influence on Shakespeare. And alongside Christopher Marlowe, he has the largest chapter in Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers.
Oh, I love it. Okay, so I will include links in the show notes for all of your stuff if somebody is listening or watching right now and they're interested in buying your work. So I'll include that in the show notes. But I want to end asking you, Darren, which Shakespeare play do you recommend that I go and read after we're done today? Now that you know I've basically only have read two. What
I
do you?
think the well, one play that instantly leapt to mind, just having a look at the image on your door there, would be Henry VIII. Although Henry VIII, also known as All Is True, is really not one of my favorite plays. I think one of the most interesting things about Henry VIII is that during a performance of the play at the Globe Theatre in 1613, this play full of pageantry and spectacle, a cannon misfired and burned the Globe Theatre down. And remarkably, for a theatrical venue with a potential capacity of 3,000 people, the only casualty was a man's breeches, so his trousers, which were put out with a bottle of ale. But I think the history plays might be a good start. So check out plays like Richard II or Richard III. And these plays are fairly early in Shakespeare's career. And I think, you know, mentioning in terms of how Shakespeare's style changes during the course of his career. Later plays, like Henry VIII, for instance, his language becomes quite knotty, quite tortive, and very different from the likes of Richard III or Romeo and Juliet, for instance. And check out Henry V as well, because I think that's such a clever historical dramatic account where it reads in many respects like a comedy that at the end of the play, Henry woos Catherine. He's just had, against all odds, victory at the Battle of Agincourt, and then the chorus reminds the audience in the epilogue that Henry VI's son will go on to lose everything that Henry gained during his reign. And I think that's testament to Shakespeare as a writer who loves to raise questions rather than provide definitive answers, that Henry V can be performed as this jingoistic celebration of England as a pro-war and pro-monarchy play, but it can also be interpreted in the exact opposite ways.
Well, Dr. Darren Freebury-Jones, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Rebecca. It's been lovely.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.